There comes a point where it doesn't hurt anymore, it just clicks. Not with a bang, but with a calm hit of awareness that sinks into your bones. You're not drowning in feelings, you're just done. The fog clears, all that noise gone. You finally see it for what it was. Not a tragedy, not a love story, just something that never truly fit. It wasn't that you didn't care enough, it wasn't that you didn't try hard enough. The late nights trying to figure her out, the second guessing, the frustration that felt like failure. None of that means you were flawed. It means you were trying to align with something that was never designed to align with you. She didn't need to be cruel for it to break you. She didn't have to be a villain. That's what makes the realization harder. There's no clear line in the sand, no moment where you can say that's why it ended. Instead, you wake up one day and realize this thing you've been holding on to wasn't feeding you. It's been eating you. You confused connection with work. You believed if you put in the effort, she'd match it. She didn't. You thought the confusion was temporary. You thought miscommunication just needed patience. But love doesn't need translation. Love doesn't live in guesswork. You kept shrinking yourself to stay. You waited, hoping each dip in the relationship would turn into a rise. You held it all together with the idea that your effort meant something had to mean something. But meaning isn't created by how much you suffer. It's revealed by how someone shows up for you consistently. That's what hit you when it all went quiet. She didn't show up. Not in the way that mattered. Not emotionally. Not steadily. She was present, maybe, but not reliable. You were building, she was fluctuating. You were steady, she was distant. And it just kept happening. Over and over. Different arguments, same feeling, different day, same exhaustion. Eventually your nervous system said what your heart wouldn't. This isn't safe anymore. So you stopped arguing with yourself. You stopped defending inconsistency. You stopped holding on based on what might happen someday. And in that stillness, it just landed without drama, without a breakdown, without a fight. She's not worth the cost, not because she's terrible, but because keeping her meant losing yourself a little more every day. And no version of love should ever require that. So you don't announce your exit. You don't burn bridges. You don't need to. You just stop carrying what was never yours to carry. And in that release, you finally come home to yourself. Here's the trap most men fall into. They measure meaning by how much they sacrificed. If it cost you sleep, it must have mattered. If it drained you emotionally, it must have been real. If you gave everything, surely that proves it was worth fighting for. But that logic is broken, and it keeps you stuck longer than you should ever stay. Sacrifice doesn't equal significance. Pain doesn't prove love. You can pour yourself into something completely wrong and still feel empty at the end. The effort you gave doesn't automatically create value. It just creates exhaustion when it's going nowhere. Think about it honestly. How many nights did you spend replaying conversations that went in circles? How many times did you bite your tongue just to keep the peace? How many moments did you suppress what you actually felt because expressing it would create another fight? That wasn't investment, that was survival. You weren't building something beautiful, you were managing something unstable. And here's what nobody tells you. Effort can be wasted completely, entirely, without any return. Just because you gave doesn't mean you'll receive. Just because you stay patient doesn't mean patience will be rewarded. You convinced yourself that endurance was strength, that holding on proved character, that walking away meant weakness, so you stayed, you adjusted, you made yourself smaller to fit into a space that was never shaped for you. But adaptation isn't love. Tolerating mistreatment isn't loyalty. Waiting for someone to finally see your worth isn't devotion. It's self-abandonment dressed up as commitment. The hard truth lands differently now. You weren't growing together. You were bending alone. She wasn't meeting you halfway. She was watching you stretch further and further while giving you just enough to keep you reaching. And that cycle repeated over and over. You gave more. She stayed the same. You adjusted expectations. She remained inconsistent. You lowered the bar. She still couldn't clear it. At some point, the math stops making sense. You realize you've been paying full price for something that was never fully available. You've been investing in potential that never converted into reality. Potential is dangerous. It keeps you hooked on a future that doesn't exist yet. It makes you ignore the present because tomorrow might be different. But tomorrow kept looking like yesterday, and yesterday never gave you what you needed. So the real question isn't whether you tried hard enough. You did. The question is whether your effort was ever being matched. It wasn't. And once you see that clearly, the guilt dissolves. You stop blaming yourself for the failure. You stop believing you could have done more. Because you already did more than the situation deserved. Your effort was real, your intentions were pure, but the destination was never reachable. Not because you lacked strength, because you were running towards someone who wasn't moving closer. That's not failure, that's finally seeing the truth. Your mind plays a cruel trick on you after you've invested deeply. It refuses to accept that the investment was misplaced, so it builds a story, a narrative that protects your ego from the weight of wasted time. You tell yourself it had to mean something. All those moments of trying, waiting, hoping, they couldn't just be empty. There had to be a purpose buried somewhere beneath the disappointment. But that's the illusion talking. Your brain is desperate to assign value where none existed. It wants to believe that suffering automatically creates significance, that if you bled enough, you earned something eternal. You didn't. What you were holding on to wasn't her. Not really. It was the idea of what she could become, if circumstances shifted, if she finally understood you, if timing aligned, if she woke up one day and chose you fully. That version of her never existed outside your imagination. You fell in love with potential, with possibility, with the woman you believed was hiding beneath the surface, waiting to emerge, but she never emerged. Because that woman wasn't real, she was a projection, a hope you kept alive through sheer willpower. And hope without evidence isn't romantic, it's delay. It keeps you suspended in limbo, waiting for a transformation that isn't coming. You weren't patient. You were stuck. There's a difference. The gap between what was real and what you wanted became the source of your suffering. You kept measuring her against who she could be, instead of accepting who she actually was. And every time reality fell short, you filled the gap with more hope. That cycle is exhausting. It drains you without giving anything back. Because you're not responding to what's in front of you. You're chasing a ghost, a future version of the relationship that exists only in your projections. She showed you who she was, repeatedly, through actions, through patterns, through consistency in her inconsistency. But you kept editing the picture, softening the edges, explaining away the red flags because acknowledging them meant confronting a painful truth. The truth that she wasn't going to change, not for you, not the way you needed. And that's not her fault entirely. People are who they are, but it becomes your responsibility when you keep expecting different results from the same equation. When you keep betting on potential instead of reality. Potential is seductive. It whispers that everything will click eventually. That one more conversation will fix things. That patience will unlock something hidden. But patience only works when both people are moving toward the same destination. She wasn't moving. You were, alone. So the meaning you kept searching for was never there. Not because the feelings weren't genuine, but because genuine feelings pointed at the wrong target don't create lasting connection. They create longing, and longing without fulfillment slowly hollows you out. That's the illusion breaking. That's reality finally being allowed to speak. Take a step back and examine what you were actually doing every single day. Not the romantic version you told yourself, the real version, the one that exhausted you without explanation. You were decoding constantly. Every text message analyzed for hidden meaning. Every pausing conversation interpreted as a signal. Every shift in her energy treated like a puzzle that needed solving before it exploded into conflict. That's not connection, that's surveillance. You became a detective in your own relationship, watching for clues, tracking her moods like weather patterns, adjusting yourself based on atmospheric pressure you couldn't control, but somehow felt responsible for managing. When did love become a full-time investigation? Real intimacy doesn't require constant monitoring. It doesn't demand you study someone's tone just to know where you stand. If you need a psychology degree just to navigate a conversation, something is fundamentally broken. But you normalized it. You convinced yourself this was just how relationships worked. That complexity meant depth. That difficulty meant you were dealing with someone substantial, someone worth figuring out. You were wrong. Complexity isn't depth. Sometimes complexity is just chaos wearing a sophisticated mask. And chaos doesn't become clarity through patience. It just becomes familiar chaos that you stop questioning. Think about how rarely you felt genuinely at ease. Not excited about future plans, not hopeful about potential changes, just calm, present, unguarded. Those moments were rare because your nervous system never got permission to rest. You were always bracing for the next shift, the next misunderstanding, The next time you'd have to explain yourself just to return to baseline stability. That's not partnership. That's emotional labor without compensation. Or nobody told you this, but emotional labor is real work. It costs energy. It depletes reserves. It takes from you even when it looks like nothing is happening on the surface. You felt tired for reasons you couldn't name, drained without obvious cause, empty even after good days together. Because the good days still required management, still required you to calibrate your words, filter your honesty, position yourself carefully to avoid triggering withdrawal. Intimacy isn't supposed to feel like negotiation. Closeness isn't supposed to require strategy. Yet there you were, planning how to bring things up, timing difficult conversations based on her mood, softening truths because direct honesty created distance instead of connection. You became smaller to maintain peace. You edited yourself constantly. The full version of you became too risky to express, so you performed a safer version, a version designed to minimize friction. But friction kept finding you anyway, because the problem wasn't your delivery, it was the dynamic itself. You were pouring effort into a structure that couldn't hold weight, and structures that can't hold weight eventually collapse, no matter how carefully you manage them. No matter how much emotional labor you contribute, you weren't loving her. You were maintaining her. And maintenance without reciprocity is just slow self-erasure. Something inside you resisted leaving for the longest time. But because walking away felt like admitting defeat, like confessing you couldn't handle what other men might have endured, that voice kept you trapped. The one whispering that real men don't quit. That strength means absorbing pain without complaint. That love requires suffering through seasons of drought without questioning whether rain will ever come. But that voice lied to you. Leaving isn't losing. Leaving is choosing accuracy over fantasy. It's refusing to keep paying for something that stopped delivering long ago. Quitting a job that destroys your health isn't weakness. Neither is exiting a relationship that slowly dismantles your identity. You stayed because you feared what departure meant. Starting over terrified you. The unknown felt heavier than the familiar ache you'd grown accustomed to carrying. At least the pain was predictable. At least you knew its shape. But predictable pain is still pain. Familiar emptiness doesn't become fullness just because you've memorized its texture. And here's what haunts you now that clarity arrived. You knew before you admitted it. Your gut sent signals months ago, maybe years. That quiet whisper underneath the noise telling you something was fundamentally off. You ignored it, overrode it with logic, convinced yourself that feelings were unreliable, that intuition was just fear dressed up as wisdom. So you pushed forward, stayed committed to a sinking vessel because abandoning ship felt cowardly. But your intuition wasn't lying. It was protecting you. And every time you dismissed it, you betrayed yourself a little deeper. That's the real wound. Not that she couldn't meet you, but that you knew it longer than you admitted and still sacrificed more time, more energy, more pieces of yourself on an altar that demanded everything and returned almost nothing. You kept waiting for evidence that justified staying, for a breakthrough moment that would validate all the struggle, for her to finally transform into the partner you needed her to become. That moment never arrived, and waiting for it cost you seasons of your life you'll never reclaim. Walking away doesn't erase what you invested, but staying wouldn't have redeemed it either. The time was already spent. The only question was whether you'd keep spending more. You finally stopped, not with anger, not with dramatic declarations, just quiet recognition that the door you kept trying to force open was never meant to lead anywhere worth going. Correction isn't failure, adjustment isn't weakness. Recognizing misalignment and responding accordingly is maturity in its purest form. You didn't abandon something precious. You released something that required constant resurrection just to appear alive. Real love doesn't need life support. Real connection breathes on its own. What you walked away from couldn't sustain itself without your endless effort. And effort without partnership isn't relationship. It's captivity with emotional decoration. You escaped. That's not defeat. That's the first honest victory you've claimed in longer than you remember. Then something shifts that you didn't expect. The storm inside your chest quiets without warning. No dramatic breakthrough. No final conversation that tied everything together. Just silence where chaos used to live. You wake up one morning and realize you haven't replayed that argument in days. The conversation you rehearsed 1,000 times no longer loops through your mind. The words you wished you'd said don't feel urgent anymore. That obsessive analysis just stopped, like a fever breaking in the middle of the night. You don't need her to understand what happened. You don't need an apology that validates your experience. You don't need a confession that proves you weren't crazy for feeling what you felt. Because when clarity is genuine, it doesn't require external confirmation. It stands on its own without needing witnesses. This is different from forcing yourself to move on, different from pretending you're fine while suppressing everything underneath. This is actual release, the kind that happens when truth finally settles deeper than emotion can reach. Memories still surface occasionally. A laugh, specific moment that once felt significant. But these memories flowed through without anchoring themselves. They passed like clouds instead of storms, present briefly, then gone without leaving damage. The emotional charge has been removed, not artificially, not through distraction or denial, but through genuine understanding that dissolved the attachment at its root. You stopped inflating good moments to justify bad patterns. That's what kept you hooked before. You'd remember one beautiful night and use it to excuse months of instability, one genuine connection weaponized against your own clarity. Now you see the full picture without selective editing. The good existed, the bad existed, neither cancels the other, both are simply true, and truth without distortion has no power to pull you backward. Closure stopped being something you sought from her. You realize closure was never hers to give. She couldn't provide resolution because she wasn't the source of your confusion. Your own resistance to seeing clearly created the chaos. Once you stopped resisting, everything resolved itself. You don't need that final conversation anymore. The one where she finally admits fault, where she acknowledges your pain, where she confirms that you mattered as much as you hoped. Those fantasies dissolve because your worth is no longer contingent on her recognition. You know what you experienced. You know what you gave. Her agreement changes nothing about the truth you've already accepted. This is freedom that doesn't announce itself loudly. It arrives quietly and stays permanently. It lives in the absence of obsessive thought, in the space where rumination used to dominate. Your mind feels lighter, not empty, lighter. There's room now for thoughts that build something instead of thoughts that just process pain. Attachment didn't require violent removal. It simply dissolved once clarity became stronger than confusion. You didn't force yourself to let go. You just finally saw clearly. And clarity released you without asking permission. Something fundamental rewired inside you after living through that level of misalignment. Not a conscious decision to change. More like an automatic upgrade your nervous system installed without asking permission. You process people differently now, faster, cleaner, without the emotional fog that used to cloud your judgment and keep you invested in situations that deserved immediate exit. Mixed signals used to intrigue you. That uncertainty felt like tension worth exploring. Maybe she's complicated. Maybe depth looks like inconsistency. Maybe you just need to understand her better. Now mixed signals just look like mixed signals. Nothing romantic about confusion. Nothing attractive about having to guess where you stand. Uncertainty isn't mystery anymore. It's information. And that information tells you everything you need to know. You recognize the difference between chemistry and anxiety now. They felt identical before. That racing heartbeat when she finally texted back, that obsessive checking of your phone, that spike of relief when things temporarily stabilize. You call that passion. But passion doesn't leave you exhausted. Passion doesn't require recovery time. What you experienced was stress disguised as excitement, nervous system activation masquerading as deep connection. Real chemistry doesn't keep you on edge, it creates expansion. It gives you room to breathe fully. It settles your body instead of keeping it perpetually braced for impact. Your tolerance for emotional inconsistency collapsed completely, not because bitterness hardened you, because experience educated you. You learned what instability costs. You paid that price in sleepless nights and fractured self-worth, and educated people don't repeat expensive mistakes. Questions you ask yourself shifted dramatically. Before you wondered if you could tolerate certain behaviors. Now you ask if you actually want to. Tolerance and desire are completely different standards. You stopped settling for what you could survive and started requiring what actually fulfills you. Struggle lost its romantic appeal entirely. You used to believe meaningful relationships require hardship. That difficulty indicated significance. That easy meant shallow, complete nonsense. Some things are difficult because they're transforming you into someone better. Other things are difficult because they're simply wrong for you. The difference isn't subtle once you've experienced both. difficulty that grows you feels purposeful. Difficulty from misalignment just feels draining. You stop romanticizing exhaustion as proof of love. Attraction still happens. Beauty still registers. Interesting people still capture your attention. But attraction no longer overrides stability requirements. If emotional steadiness isn't present underneath the initial spark, interest dies naturally. No internal debate necessary. Your standards sharpened without any conscious effort to raise them. They elevated automatically because you finally understood what lowering them actually cost. Every compromise you made to keep something broken functioning took pieces of you that required years to recover. Never again, not from anger, not from resentment, from simple mathematics. The equation doesn't balance when stability isn't present, and unbalanced equations don't deserve continued investment. You're not closed off, you're calibrated, and calibration protects you without requiring constant vigilance. The phrase stopped being about her specifically somewhere along this journey. It transformed into something larger, a principle that guides decisions automatically without requiring deliberation or emotional processing. She's not worth it became a filter, a standard applied universally to anything demanding more than it returns. Not just romantic connections, friendships that drain without replenishing, professional situations that take without acknowledging, family dynamics that extract without appreciating. The filter works instantly now. Cost versus return calculated in moments rather than months. If something requires sacrificing peace, clarity, or self-respect, the answer arrives before the question finishes forming. You don't announce this standard to anyone. Declarations aren't necessary when behavior communicates everything. People notice the shift without understanding its source. Something changed in how you carry yourself, how quickly you disengage from nonsense, how little you tolerate games that once consumed your attention. Looking back doesn't tempt you anymore. Not because discipline prevents it, because genuinely nothing pulls you in that direction. The past holds no gravity when the present feels aligned. She exists in memory without existing in longing. A chapter concluded, a lesson absorbed, nothing more requiring attention. Her perspective on what happened stopped mattering entirely. Whether she regrets it, whether she finally understands what she lost, whether she tells others a version that paints you unfairly. None of it registers as important. Your peace doesn't depend on her narrative. Your worth doesn't require her acknowledgement. Your future doesn't need her closure. Everything you needed, you gave yourself. The loneliness that scared you before lost its power completely. Being alone stopped feeling like punishment. It started feeling like protection. Space held, open for something actually aligned, instead of space filled with misalignment, just to avoid emptiness. You'd rather wait in peace than settle in chaos. That preference changed everything about how you move through the world. New connections get evaluated differently now. Patterns get recognized immediately. Potential red flags don't receive the benefit of extended doubt. You've learned that early signals rarely lie. They just get ignored by people too hopeful to accept what they're seeing. You're not that person anymore. Something quiet and permanent settled into your foundation. Not coldness, not cynicism. Just clarity that doesn't waver based on external circumstances. A grounded certainty about what you will and won't accept. She wasn't the loss in this story. You were the gain. Every painful moment contributed to building someone who refuses to abandon himself for connection. Someone who understands that love shouldn't require self-erasure. Someone who knows his presence is valuable and treats it accordingly. You didn't just survive this experience. You let it sculpt you into someone unbreakable. And if this message helped you recognize your own worth more clearly, subscribe to this channel. More content designed to strengthen your mindset and align your standards arrives regularly. Your next chapter deserves someone who won't require you to read this message again.